going to preach my fifth and final lesson in a series on the music of the church. And on the chart that I produced in the bulletin a few weeks ago on kinds of music, under vocal music we had two categories, verbal and then nonverbal, like whistling, humming, or simulating instruments with your voice. Then under verbal, we had two categories, congregational and choral. We've come to the point in our series today where I want to address choirs and solos in the worship assembly. And with that, our series will conclude. I want to point out, brethren, that the New Testament requires a worship assembly such as this. Now, admittedly, you may worship alone, or a few may worship together. However, in addition to private devotions, New Testament Christians regularly assembled as congregations for what we call corporate worship. The whole church came together in one place. 1 Corinthians 14:23. Christians were taught not to forsake the assembling of themselves together. Hebrews 10:25. Every first day of the week, when they met together, Acts 20 and verse 7, they worshiped God through 5 avenues of worship. Public worship included worshiping through preaching and teaching. They continued steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine, Acts 2 and verse 42. And they worshiped through giving, as God had prospered them on the first day of the week, 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 and 2. They communed in worship through the Lord's Supper, Acts 20 and verse 7, upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread. And when mentioned in conjunction with other items of worship, the breaking of bread refers to the Lord's Supper, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 16. They also prayed in worship. Prayers were a part of the public worship of the Jerusalem church, Acts 2:42, and must be in ours, 1 Thessalonians 5 and 22. And then worship also included singing. Hebrews 2:12 saying, I will declare thy name unto the brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto thee. That's talking about the assembly. Singing praise in the midst of the church shows there is to be an assembly, and that in the midst of it, there is to be singing. These are all avenues through which we worship God. Now, in this lesson tonight, this morning, we're concerned with choirs and solos in the worship assembly of the church. Let's look at some arguments against it, and then we'll take a look at some arguments that are being made for it. So that'll be our two divisions of our lesson. First of all, arguments against having choirs and solos in the worship of the Lord's church. I want to say, number one, that singing is a required act of worship to be offered by all Christian priests. You know, the New Testament teaches the priesthood of all believers. Jesus Christ is our high priest after the order of Melchizedek, Hebrews 5 and verse 6. All of us others are priests under Jesus. In the Christian system, we don't have a special class of priest like the Levites in the Old Covenant, like the Jews had in the tribe of Levi. But under Jesus, all Christians are members of the priesthood, both males and females. And worship is to be offered by priest. And under the Christian system, every baptized believer is a priest and is commanded to sing. 1 Peter 2 and verse 9, you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. We are a holy priesthood. And when people obey the gospel and when they come up out of the water, they're clothed with the authority of a priestly office. When you're born from above, you become a royal priest. Revelation 1, 5, and 6. And you're allowed by God to serve in his temple, the church, because of the words of Christ, our high priest. And as priest, we're to offer up sacrifices. Well, it's different from the old covenant. We don't offer up sacrifices of bulls and of goats, but a sacrifice of lips, tuned to eternity. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5, you also as lively stones are built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices, acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. So congregational singing is not just an exercise to pass the time. It's a period when priests are making their sacrifices unto God. Hebrews 13:15, by him therefore let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks unto his name. Each priest makes his or her own sacrifice. It's not something that can be turned over to a group of talented people. It's the work of each priest. Each act of worship involves personal participation in public prayers in which we are led. Those prayers are to be our prayers. And to those prayers we are to say, Amen. 1 Corinthians 14:16. In the grace of giving, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 16:2, upon the first day of the week, let every one of you so lay by him in store as God prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come. In preaching, we worship as we hear and as we heed. In partaking of the Lord's Supper, we have to discern the Lord's body as we partake. Singing is also a time of personal participation. If all the saints are commanded to sing, how could one, a soloist, or some, a choir, fulfill that requirement? The New Testament does not sanction the idea of worship by proxy. One segment of the church can no more sing for another than it can observe the Lord's Supper for another. If somebody else can sing for me, then he can give for me, then he can listen for me, then he can pray for me, and he can partake of the Lord's Supper for me. God expects faithful worship from each Christian. And since you are a priest, God's looking for your sacrifice. Now, secondly, spiritual, scriptural singing and worship involves an interchange of action. And I want us to take a look at the two texts that are most crucial to the topic. Turn over to Ephesians 5:18 and 19, especially verse 19. Then we'll look at the companion passage in Colossians 3 and verse 16. Ephesians 5:19. Speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord. All right, there's one. Now go over to Colossians 3:16. Here's your companion passage. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. Now, the language of those verses suggests to us that a church worship assembly is in view, is being envisioned. First of all, the language involves a plurality of individuals, entire congregations, in the obligations that are enjoined. Second, you have the plural participles: speaking, singing, making melody, teaching, and all those indicate the activity of the church as a whole. And the force of Paul's language there is all of you speaking, all of you singing, all of you making melody, all of you giving thanks, all of you submitting yourselves. In other words, this involves the activity of the whole church, not just some small portion of it. And then third, you have the phrases speaking to yourselves in Ephesians 5:19, or teaching and admonishing one another in Colossians 3:16. To yourselves and one another, they're what are called reciprocal reflexive pronouns. And they represent an interchange of action in the verbs that are being used. The Oxford English Dictionary says reciprocal means as done by each of two to the other. It involves action by each or all parties at the same moment of time, or in close proximity to all of the participants to the extent that they perform the activity together. And then in Summers' Greek grammar, he says, in function, it represents an interchange of action between the members of a plural subject. Well, that plural subject to which Paul directed his remarks was the Ephesian church and the Colossian church. This is referring to congregational singing and the interchange that is involved in it. When the church as a whole sings, there is a speaking to one another. There's a mutual exchange. God wants his people to know the joy that comes from joining in songs of praise together. Christians may sing in unison, or they may sing in four-part harmony. But everybody ought to be actively involved in the song. And the inclusive nature of four-part harmony makes it very different from the exclusiveness of special music that features soloist and group singing and worship. When soloists or choirs or quartets are set apart to perform on their own, the interchange of action described in these verses is not taking place. It can't be fulfilled. When you have one group that is active as a choir, and then you have another group that is completely passive as a listening audience, there's no interchange of action there. So choirs or solos do not fulfill the requirements of these verses. This is describing congregational singing, not choirs or solos. And these reciprocal pronouns underscore the unity in the church. Any person in the church at Ephesus who did not sing, did not speak, did not make melody, did not give thanks, did not submit himself, wouldn't be obeying the command contained in those verses. Now, an exception, of course, would be those whose physical limitations prevented them from being able to comply. But otherwise, all were to sing and be spoken to by singing. I've known deaf people, who did their singing by signing. And they did what they could. But this is precisely what we do in congregational singing, but it's not done by choirs or by solos. Now I want to address some arguments that are being made for choirs and solos in the worship. Turn over to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and let's take a look at verse 26. This is the verse that most often comes up. Some contend that 1 Corinthians 14:26 contains New Testament authority for solos in the worship assembly. 1 Corinthians 14:26 says, "How is it then, brethren, when ye come together, every one of you hath a psalm, hath a doctrine, hath a tongue, hath a revelation, hath an interpretation? Let all things be done unto edifying." Now I want to note several things about this verse. The first thing I want to mention is, you'll notice it does not even mention singing. It doesn't even mention singing. A psalm can be read or quoted as easily as it can be sung. And before that verse could prove solo singing, you have to prove that the psalm was to be sung at all, and that cannot be done. Secondly, each one has a psalm may refer to a song leader who's motivated to lead a pertinent song. And Paul was critical of the Corinthians because song leaders, tongue speakers, and prophets were just jumping up and speaking at the same time, causing a bunch of chaos. And Paul corrected them, and he said unto, "Let all things be done unto edifying." And then later he said, "Let all things be done decently and in order." Now, it's interesting to me as I studied this, be turning back to 1 Corinthians 1:12, that there are 3 verses in 1 Corinthians in which the Apostle Paul uses this expression, "every one," in connection with something they were already doing. And then the other 2 verses that I found, he was rebuking them for what they were doing. And Professor Harold Moulton said this Greek adjective is used to highlight that selfish individualism that characterized these saints. The first time it's found is 1 Corinthians 1:12. "Now this I say that every one of you saith, I am of Paul, and I am of Apollos, and I of Cephas, and I of Christ." You see there he's admonishing them because everyone had adopted the name of the person who immersed him. Would one want to use that verse to argue that it's in harmony with the Lord for men to be divided and to call themselves by human names in religion? Well, of course not. And then turn over to chapter 11 and verse 21, and here I find it again. In 1 Corinthians 11:21, "For in eating every one taketh before other his own supper, and one is hungry, and another is drunken." Well, again, would you use that verse to prove it's right for some in their gatherings to eat while others remain hungry? If I were to use those 2 verses to prove such things, then I'd be making the same kind of argument that some are making from 1 Corinthians 14:26 in an effort to prove that it's right to have solo singing in our worship. The context of all those passages is Paul correcting the errors of his brethren in Corinth and not commending them for what they were doing. Is it proper to seek biblical authority in a rebuke? I don't think so. And then third, another possibility is that during the days of spiritual gifts, some at Corinth could have been inspired to teach the members new songs. That's a possibility. In other words, a psalm could have been presented to the congregation phrase by phrase, with the church joining in. I've seen that happen before in teaching new songs, in which case this is not a solo being talked about at all. But the point is, with all that said, an ambiguous allusion to individual Corinthian Christians having a song is a flimsy justification for seeking uninspired solo singing in the worship of the church today. A valid rule of biblical interpretation is an inconclusive passage where the meaning is not clear must not be allowed to alter the plain meaning of clear passages. Ephesians 5:19, Colossians 3:16 are clear. They are plain, and they undeniably authorize congregational singing and worship. Well, here's another argument. Some argue that if a chorus, a college chorus for example, can sing 5 minutes after the dismissal prayer, why not during the services? And then other people have sadly gone to the other extreme, and they have set forth the idea that choirs and choruses and solos outside the worship assembly are sinful. That's the other extreme. Now, I have set forth in the introduction of my lesson today that the New Testament requires a worship assembly, which is called by church leadership. And such an assembly has a beginning and it has an ending. I don't believe in the false doctrine that everything you do is worship. You know, in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 5, Abraham said unto his young men, "Abide ye here with the ass, and I and the lad will go yonder and worship, and come again to you." Well, Abraham knew that his worship over there was going to have a beginning, and it was going to have an ending. And we need to understand that our worship assembly has a beginning and it has an ending. And we're wrong when we mock the dismissal prayer, as I see some people do. We're wrong when we do that. When there is no call to worship by church leadership, I am not obligated to participate, even though other people may be singing. Now, I want to illustrate that this way. At the church at Greenfield where I preached, for quite some time we had a 30-minute singing class prior to our corporate worship on Sunday night. I want to say our worship started at 6 o'clock. The singing class started at 5:30. There was a large group of people that came to this singing class. It was something that Martha and I really enjoyed. We had a great song leader who led that class. Often new songs were taught. Sometimes I participated. At other times, I might be dealing with announcements. Or I might have been in a meeting with the elders who met on Sunday night before services. My participation was optional. It was not obligatory. Were they worshiping? Sure they were. They were worshiping. I was not. But when the worship assembly began on the hour, as set forth by the elders, we were all obligated to commence worship in song. I read about how Paul and Silas sang in prison. In Acts 16:25, at midnight, Paul and Silas prayed and sang praises unto God, and the prisoners heard them. Here's a case where some were singing and others were listening. And Paul and Silas were certainly worshiping, but that was not a called worship assembly of the church. Here's another example. So one day I had a man on a Bible Answer with me as a panelist. Not only was he a preacher, but he was a great song leader. And we had done our business for the day. We had recorded our programs, and we were up on the 8th floor of the Fine Arts Building at Murray State University. And we all get into the elevator. And as we are descending down the 8th floors of the building, all of a sudden, spontaneously, the preacher-song leader began to sing a song as we traveled down the 8th floors. We were under no obligation whatsoever to join in, and none of us chose to do so. We've got to be careful not to make arguments that disregard the parameters of corporate worship. Finally, somebody argues, if it's all right to have choirs or solos to sing in a wedding or at a funeral, then why not in the worship assembly? You know, on rare occasions, at the request of grieving families, we've allowed solos and groups of singers at funerals or at weddings. We recently did it at a funeral. Weddings or funerals may include acts of prayer. They may include the singing of hymns. They may include the reading of Scripture. And they are thus considered as religious services. However, they are not scheduled worship assemblies of the church. Their focus is not worship unto God, but rather to celebrate the union of two eligible parties in matrimony, or to honor the dead. It's to remember or to honor the dead. And it's also an opportunity to teach the living too. It's a religious service, but it is not a called worship assembly of the church. And that obviously deals with a matter of judgment that has to be determined based on the principles set forth in the Scriptures. Yet we have seen that in the worship assembly of the New Testament church, what has God enjoined? God has enjoined congregational singing as the music of the church. Do we have music? Absolutely. It's a kind of vocal music. It's called singing. And that's what God's enjoined upon us. He desires participation by the whole church. Solos and choirs, as we've seen, don't fit the bill, according to Colossians 3:16 and Ephesians 5:19. And it was really the decay of congregational singing that invited special groups, special music groups around the 5th century. Listen to these words from John Chrysostom, an early Christian writer. He said, "It was the ancient custom, as it is still with us, for all to come together and unitedly to join in singing. The young and the old, rich and poor, male and female, bond and free, all join in one song. All worldly distinctions here ceased, and the whole congregation formed one general chorus." Brethren, that's the way it should be. Our worship must be from spirit, from the heart, and from truth according to God, as God directs. And the joy of singing here in worship as we've done today is just a foretaste of the joy of all the saints singing around the throne of God for eternity. The lesson is yours if you need to obey the gospel of Jesus Christ today, by faith putting on the Lord in baptism or to be restored. We can assist you in any way. We urge you to come while together we stand and sing.